Hello, Brooke. Today I want to ask you, what is the correlation between ADHD and dopamine?
Sure. So ADHD was the first disorder actually that was found as a result of a deficiency of a specific neurotransmitter, believe it or
Mhm,
not. And the neurotransmitter was norepinephrine, which is synthesized within the brain.
mhm,
And the basic building block of norepinephrine is dopa, which is the tiny molecule converted into dopamine, which in turn then turns into norepinephrine. So, dopamine, how it affects ADHDers is it allows us to regulate emotional responses and to take action to achieve some rewards. So, it gives us that feeling of pleasure and reward. And where ADHDers struggle with dopamine is sometimes we have really high levels of dopamine and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have really low levels of dopamine, where the neurotypical brain can just drop dopamine throughout the day. People with ADHD are seeking that dopamine. They have low levels of dopamine very often, unless they're in a hyper focus mode where the dopamine then rises.
mhm.
Um, so it's very different with people who have ADHD and those without it. So a lot of ADHDers take medication to help with their dopamine and neurotransmitters.
Mhm.
And that medication, like amphetamines, can actually increase your dopamine by 10x. You could 10x your dopamine, which it's actually the highest thing that I know of that can increase your dopamine levels. And that's why a lot of ADHDers do take amphetamines to help them stay focused and activated in their brain to get that dopamine regulated.
Mhm.
There's a couple of other things unrelated to amphetamines, like chocolate. So Andrew Huberman talks about that giving 1.5% times as much dopamine to an ADHDer, but it goes away after a few minutes. Sex
Mhm.
and the thought of sex can be 2 times the amount. Nicotine, that's why some ADHDers smoke, because it actually gives you 2.5 times above your dopamine baseline. Cocaine, 2.5 times. And as I mentioned, amphetamines and dopamine, we have these baselines of it. And if we go over those baselines, then we can actually, once we get there, deplete our dopamine afterwards.
Yes.
So it's interesting.
Yes. Um, I think you bring up a really good point about the dopamine baseline. Medication is one of the things you bring up. Medication, what it does is, for us with ADHD, our dopamine's shooting so much through our synaptic cleft in our brain, and the medications like amphetamines and other ADHD medication stimulants inhibit dopamine and keep it in the synaptic cleft instead of getting absorbed right away. So we have more to work with, and that right there, I think, is why the 10x is such a large number. But I think it's super important to increase your natural dopamine baseline. What I mean by that is there's habits that you can change in your day-to-day schedule that raises up your baseline rather than lowering it. There's a lot of activities out there that we do. Like we said, there's alcohol, sex, caffeine, and drugs, social media, food. There's a lot of unhealthy food and social media that raises your dopamine, that we do, and it's really large spikes. And then there's really severe drops after those spikes, and that right there causes the depletion of dopamine. The easily releasable pool is literally not around to be released, which makes you feel lousy, and that's what happens. And there's a handful of tools you could do, and it's kind of like a dopamine fast. Say you're playing video games every day. You're playing and playing and playing and playing and playing. I guess you could say an addiction progresses, and you start losing interest in school and working out, and you kind of fall into that depression state. It's very common because that depletion of dopamine has happened. You have no more dopamine in your dopamine pool, and I think it's key to maybe fast a little bit, take a break. Don't follow that. I guess that routine that you've been following, and take a break. Let your dopamine reset. Don't hit those spikes anymore, because when those spikes hit, your dopamine baseline lowers. You want to raise it back up. You want more dopamine in your dopamine pool. Um, Say you're working out. Sometimes we work out and we want to have a cup of coffee before our favorite cup of coffee. Sometimes we want to have some pre-workout. Sometimes we're listening to music and we want to go at our favorite time of day. Those are multiple layers to keep us motivated during our workout.
Absolutely.
Those right there become a really large spikes of dopamine. You really just to work out. So I think it's key to kind of randomize the way you work out. Sometimes go at a different time of day. Sometimes wake up super early when you don't. Sometimes go super late when you don't, or don't listen to music, or don't drink any coffee. Kind of, it's very hard. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's very important to bring your baseline back to normal, and it'll help you have a much more uplifted energy in general. That natural energy, I think it's super important.
Yes.
Andrew Huberman. I'm sorry, Andrew Huberman. You brought him up. He talks a lot about this. He's a neuroscientist, and he talks a lot more science. He's a lot more. He knows the actual numbers and facts behind it. But it's super important to bring that dopamine baseline back to lower it down instead of my bad, raising it up instead of lowering it down.
Yeah. You know what I found interesting also that Andrew Huberman was sharing is that with exercise, not all exercise increases dopamine. So if you're not liking the exercise, you're actually going to get less dopamine than if you were to like the exercise and enjoy it, or no dopamine at all. So
Mhm.
if he calls it subjective experience. So on how much you enjoy your exercise, if you enjoy it, you're going to 2x your dopamine levels. If you dislike it, less dopamine, no dopamine. And I also thought what was really cool was the cold water exposure.
Yes.
Where if you like are exposed, you jump into really cold water, it increases your dopamine level, and then it actually sustains that dopamine level after you get out of the cold water too. Thought that was
Mhm.
interesting.
I want to run it back to those layers, those conditions you add to your activities that increase dopamine. Sometimes we listen to music in the car. That music right there is just increase the dopamine during the ride. Sometimes we're having a drink, alcohol with our friends, and alcohol increases dopamine. Sometimes we're drinking coffee before work, and sometimes we're on our phone during class. These are moments that we're adding these layers onto our activities, just increase the dopamine. I think it's important to kind of um, do like an intermittent fasting of dopamine. Like sometimes don't have that cup of coffee, sometimes don't listen to that music, sometimes don't have that beer or that glass of wine. Just randomize it. It's super important. And if you don't know when to randomize it, because it is intermittent, you can't really put a routine on it. You don't want those crazy spikes to occur in a pattern. You can just flip a coin. Yeah, it's like a dopamine supportive element. Flip a coin and figure out what you're going to do that day. So I think that's very key to bring your dopamine baseline back up, because it is in the end of the day, it's what keeps our energy and satisfaction, motivation, focus up, concentration, focus, all those things that us with ADHD we have to use.
Right, right. Yeah. And I love the intermittent piece because for those of us who love coffee, who love our ADHD medication, we want it more because our dopamine levels are increased. However, once we're off of it or the effects wear off, the level falls and the symptoms return. So
Mhm, mhm.
we are seeking that feeling again. So I like what you had mentioned about intermittent. So you're not relying on all of those things to increase it.
100%. It's good for your brain. It's kind of like tricking your brain in a way, I guess you could say, and not always satisfying, because listen, dopamine is one currency for motivation and reward. It's a chemical in your brain that is released through many things we've brought up, cocaine, sex, and food. social media, all these things. And it's one currency that we can control in many ways. And it's super important to understand the spikes, understand the peak and the baseline that you have. It's not easy. We always want to eat our good food and hang out on our phone and do this and that. But just understanding, having in the back of your head will help you formulate these good habits and reset your dopamine baseline.